So this past week, I went to Richmond, Virginia for the first time. Have you been to Richmond? Yeah, many people. It's cooler than I thought it was going to be. It has got like this funkiness about it, and it was really terrific. There was a lot to do there. Maymount Park, 100-acre park with a historic home on it, beautiful gardens. There were mom groups with strollers there. There was school groups that were there. The Virginia Museum of Fine Arts is actually a really excellent museum. Whistler to Cassatt, American Painters in France, was the exhibit that I saw, and lots of other things in their collection. There are breweries there, if that's your flavor, Hollywood Cemetery, and Monument Row, of course. So Monument Row, I had always pictured that Monument Row was going to be a pedestrian walkway with statues on either side of the street memorializing Confederate generals. These are the heroes in a narrative of a country torn apart by many things, including the fight to keep humans enslaved. And General Robert E. Lee was the first monument to be installed in 1890. But if you've been to Richmond, Monument Row is nothing like that at all, other than the statues, which also is not like that at all because they're no longer there. It was nothing like I imagined. I don't even know where I got that idea of in my mind that that's what it was going to look like. It's a wide tree-lined road with a center divide of grass and trees. It is lined with beautiful homes on either side. And in the center was where the monuments stood. Today, only the Arthur Ashe statue remains on Monument Row. They've all been taken down and moved other places. That these were part of the movement in the wake of protests following the killing of George Floyd. But I'm very interested in this idea of monuments, of how we build them and why we build them and what we're trying to achieve. It prompted me to think about this when I was there. So with a Google search, because I figured I would get the answer to everything in that, I came across an interesting report by the United Nations in 2014 that is titled Memorializing Process in Post-Conflict and Divided Societies. It's an interesting report. I think that we have to think about why we create memorials and what we're trying to get out of it. So, quoting the summary of it, in her report, the special rapporteur stresses that entire cultural and symbolic landscapes are designed through memorials and museums, which both reflect and shape negatively or positively social interactions and people's cognition of identities, their own as well as that of others. Accordingly, actions in the cultural field are critical for achieving the overall societal goals of transitional justice and sustainable peace. So here she's talking about this need that how we present our story is how we create a memorial. Right? So who are the victors? Who are the heroes of your story? Who are the villains? What is it that you are memorializing is important in the context of this report for societies who are trying to come to grips with past actions. It continues, she makes a number of recommendations grounded in the principle that memorialization should be understood as the process that provides the spaces necessary to those affected by human rights violations to articulate their narratives. Memorial practices should stimulate and promote civic engagement, critical thinking, and discussion regarding the representation of the past, but equally the contemporary challenges of exclusion and violence. It's a fascinating, thought-provoking report. But that was the conflict. But what are we memorializing? What values are being lifted up and honored by those memorials, not just those that stood at Monument Row, but in general. So now in the Bible, there are memorials as well. Back in the Bible, 2 Samuel 18:18 says, "Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken the pillar which is in the valley of the king and set it up for himself, set up a matzevet. For he said, I have no sons to keep my name alive. He had named the pillar after himself, and it was called the Absalom's monument, or literally it's Absalom's hand to this day," the verse says. So there is a teaching, this is a teaching about the design of a monument. Rashi, in a totally other place, references this monument. He references this other monument. In 1 Chronicles, Rashi says that another explanation of, and he called it Yad Absalom, was that Absalom engraved the form of the length of his hand in the middle of the monument. That on it, he had placed an image of at least his hand, but I think that there was a grander feeling of it. So the point of the monument for him was to be remembered. He had no sons. Rashi points out he had sons, but just none that he thought were worthy of honoring himself. So he built his own matzeva. Now in Genesis 35, so earlier, we see another matzeva, that Jacob builds a matzeva for Rachel. Thus Rachel died. She was buried on the road to Ephrath, now Bethlehem. Over her grave, Jacob set up a pillar, a matzeva. It is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. That verse says in Genesis. So today, this is what we refer to as a gravestone. A gravestone is not as grand as Monument Avenue, Monument Row, but it is supposed to be some type of memorial to a person. But like the UN report cited, our memorial practices should stimulate and promote what I think is the best of us. It should remember and encapsulate the best of us. So I have mixed feelings about a matzeva, about a stone. I certainly personally have the preference compared to some cemeteries where it's just a flat marker on the ground, which is excellent for landscaping. But I like the upright stone as a personal preference. There's part of me that likes the idea of having a place, a central, intentional place where I can be and think about that person. And of course, as a rabbi, I visit cemeteries a lot. And when I go to the Bethel cemeteries, I like to visit with my friends and people at the shul who I remember. It acts as a prompt to remember someone that I haven't thought about in some time, whether it's at Judean Gardens or Garden of Remembrance or King David. King David's a little more complicated because it's, we don't have a section there. It's spread out all over. But I like to wander through and to visit people, if you will. Sometimes the names trigger something I hadn't thought about in a long time. But also, I don't feel bound by a place. I don't feel bound by thinking about a person only when I go to a particular location. Yesterday was my dad's 12th English yard site. And I barely have ever visited his grave. I mean, he's buried in the Bay Area, and I don't go to San Francisco often. It's easier for my mom to come visit here, which she does frequently. Look for her next week. She'll be back. But I think about him almost every day. My relationship with my dad is not about that place, but in so many other places. Right? And in a sense, he and I were never in that place together. So it doesn't make sense that I would need that place to remember things in which we never shared anything. He and I were only at the cemetery one time together, and he wasn't really there in the sense that we're talking about. So how do we build a matzeva? I think of a matzeva of values and not of just a location. This is how I build my memorial related to my dad. Not in a place, but by my practices. How I treat others, how I treat myself, how I raise my kids, how I treat my colleagues, how I am a partner, how I am a friend, how I am a teacher, and how I am a learner, how I treat a stranger, and how I treat a friend, how I am generous, and how I am humble, how I am creative, and how I am flexible. How do I leave space for others, and how do I speak up for myself? This is how I build a matzeva of values to honor my father and other people that I love. It is not about a place, but it's how I try to walk through the world. So maybe this is how I build my own monument row. It would be lined with the people and the values that I want to live by. It would not be static or a simple museum to others. It would be a place pushing me to be better, inviting me to follow others' examples, and a place where I would metaphorically return to often to be embraced and comforted and energized for living up to these values. So who would live on your monument row? And what are the values that they modeled for you? We'll begin Yizkor in just a moment, page 330.